welcome to What You Need to Know with Carla Pileggi Caviola. Today on our show, we will be talking about perinatal psychosis with our special guest, Teresa Twomey. Teresa Twomey is a consultant, writer, speaker, and authority on perinatal psychosis, which is psychosis that occurs during pregnancy and the postpartum period. I had the pleasure of meeting Teresa many years ago when she and I met and also eventually became the founders of Postpartum Support International in the state of Connecticut, and we formed a Connecticut chapter. She has done amazing work in Connecticut and beyond, and I'm happy to know her as a friend and colleague. Teresa Twomey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we're going to jump right in, Teresa. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your story, personal and educational background, if you will, and we'll start from there.
Okay. So I was a practicing attorney with my own professional mediation practice doing business mediation when my husband and I decided we were going to try for a baby and got pregnant and had a great pregnancy. And then gave birth, and then everything that hit the fan pretty much. And
Okay.
I had a number of different symptoms of things early on, but I also had a lot of physical things go wrong. And none of that was anything I would have expected, but I did have a traumatic birth, and a complicated physical recovery. So I think those things did a little bit of masking what was going on with me mentally and emotionally. And of course, the psychosis elements, well, they are in our head and then can affect our behaviors. But if you are trying to hide it, if you're alone a lot, if you don't know the conversations to have with your husband, or if your family doesn't know how to spot what's going on, it isn't necessarily obvious. So even though I was saying things like, I can't do this, I'm a bad mom, I'm not coping, I need help, I think that was sort of taken as, of course you need help, you're not well physically, or of course you're having struggles emotionally because you're not well physically. But I don't think anybody expected that I was going to have something like this, even my providers. Because as you know, we have a myth in our society that severe mental illness occurs to a certain type of person. And those were the kind of myths that I believed before I got ill. And I'm pretty sure influenced those around me, even my providers. So I was not diagnosed right away. But then I had a number of different hallucinations.
You're talking about postpartum psychosis, just to clarify to the audience.
Right.
In addition to all of those complications, traumatic birth, emotional, and just feeling overwhelmed, like having a hard time, suddenly you had an onset of postpartum psychosis.
Right. And I also, so I had what one advocate called the Cadillac of perinatal mood disorders, in that I also had, following the psychosis, I had severe depression. But around the same time as the psychosis, I had PTSD and I had OCD. Of course, I didn't know these things at the time.
Sure.
I just knew I was kind of a mess. But I had both visual and auditory hallucinations. The worst of it was a hallucination where I thought I had killed my child. And I had decided, once I got well again, that nobody was ever going to know what happened to me. Remember, I'm a professional in a field that isn't friendly to mental illness. Not that most professional fields are. But I didn't want it to impact my career. I didn't want it to impact my relationships. I didn't want to go come public with something that was so stigmatized and discriminated against. So I wasn't going to tell anybody. And then the Andrea Yates tragedy occurred. And I just knew, if we don't have people who are survivors coming forward and sharing what this illness is actually about, then we're going to just keep having tragedies like that. And then I realized after a while, hoping somebody else would do it, that I was in a good position to do it because um, I thought that if somebody who had harmed someone was the person who tried to raise the awareness, what they said could easily be discounted.
I
I
see.
had nothing to gain from it. I only stood to lose. So I figured people couldn't say, oh, you have this ulterior motive. So,
Sure.
and that was when I started working on writing my book.
Wow. Now, at that point, Teresa, correct me if I'm wrong. You had all so you'd all the time had passed though. At this point, you had been fully recovered from the postpartum psychosis, correct? So now you were feeling able to write the book and start helping to bring awareness to this, perinatal psychosis or postpartum psychosis that can hit after delivery, whether it's a C-section or a vaginal birth, it doesn't matter, right? But in just to backtracking a little bit, when you actually had those symptoms and you didn't know what was going on, and like you said, there was a multiple things going on, right? PTSD, some OCD, and then of course the postpartum psychosis. Did you get help? Did you have providers that were able to help treat you at that point?
No, like I said, I was kind of telling anybody who had listened that I needed help, but I wasn't being really specific about why, about what I was experiencing. And at one point, when I was at the provider's office and they asked how I was doing, like how well I was coping, and I just like collapsed in tears and I was like, I'm not coping. I can't do this. I'm a terrible mother. And they didn't say anything more, took me into a room for a physical, and that was that. It was just
Wow.
um so
Right.
and we didn't really know how to get help, or actually even if there was help available.
Okay.
I didn't have a name for what I was going through.
Yeah, yeah. And it sounds like, unfortunately, your providers just didn't know to maybe try to discern and like rule out like actually what's going on here, right? And again, hopefully nowadays things are better in the landscape of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, including perinatal psychosis, right? So, thank you so much for sharing your personal story. And I'm sure there's so much more that we can hear about that and learn from you about it. But I also know our time is short. So
Yes.
I want to move on to this amazing book that I have here. This is your book, Understanding Postpartum Psychosis, A Temporary Madness. And in this book, Teresa, you talked about how you really felt called to write this book. Can you share a little bit about what moved you to do so? I know you mentioned a little bit after like the Andrea Yates situation.
Yep. Yeah. So the Andrea Yates was what spurred me to want to get the information out, and a book seemed like the best idea.
Hmm.
But part of it was I wanted to have a variety of women's stories so people could understand it from different aspects, not just my own. But I also realized that what was in the media was problematic. The way we looked at the history was problematic. Certainly, our legal approach was problematic. How we understood the difference between OCD and PPP was problematic, and then just understanding it generally. So those are the things that the book addresses, because there's so much myth and misunderstanding sort of throughout the different elements that intersect with mental illness generally, but with perinatal psychosis specifically. And even what you were saying about hoping that now clinicians and providers are more likely to catch it. According to the NIH, there still is underdiagnosed, and there are misdiagnoses, including a number of survivors that I know who are much closer to their time of childbirth than I am. My kids are much older.
Wow. So there's so much work yet to be done, right, Teresa? But again, this is an amazing book. For anyone that doesn't have a copy of it, definitely order this book, Understanding Postpartum Psychosis, A Temporary Madness. You have done a very thorough job in like you said, looking at all of those aspects on how we can tackle this and how we can get people the help that they need. So just to clarify a little bit, I guess, is that kind of how you got into this line as a consultant, writer, speaker, and authority on perinatal psychosis? Or was there another part of your story that kind of, helped you to kind of move into this?
Well, I'd say there are two main things. One is I became a maternal mental health advocate through Postpartum Support International, first as a coordinator in Virginia, and then other positions afterwards, because there really was nothing available for me to advocate specifically about perinatal psychosis. And it was hard to find other people to like share their stories in my book. In fact, one author that I met, I mentioned that I wanted to do this book, and she was like, "Oh, you're not going to be able to do that because you can't get enough stories." And she asked me how many stories I had, and at that point I had like 11 or 13 or whatever, and she was like, "That's enough, go for it," because it was
Yeah.
just so hard for anybody to get that many stories. I have learned a ton since the book has been published. I created a support group that has had over 1,000 people join it. I've done peer support for hundreds of survivors of this illness. And I've learned a ton since my book was published. Um, and so that's another route to all of that, is how much I've learned from survivors about how much more needs to be done as well. When I wrote my book, I was seeing that as the culmination of what I was going to do, and then I was going to move on and back to my professional life. But then I realized, one, there was still so much to do, and as a good friend of mine, Peter Roche, told me, "You think this is the end? Really, this is just the beginning." When I published the book.
Wow. That's amazing. Amazing work, amazing, what what you've been able to do, even in, and you're still doing it. There's still a lot more work to do here, but you've certainly paved the way for so many more people to get help, right? Where often this is kind of a mental health, including perinatal psychosis, there can come with a lot of shame and guilt, right? Which is unfortunate because it's nobody's fault to have a certain diagnosis like this or, other mental health illnesses. And just to clarify to the audience, what are the symptoms that, pregnant and postpartum moms might experience with perinatal psychosis?
So the typical things that get talked about are hallucinations, which can be it can be something you smell, it could be something you see, it could be something you hear. You can have disorganized thought. For me, one of the things I noticed is I couldn't read, and I couldn't follow a plot on television, to the point where I couldn't tell the difference between a commercial and a show. Um,
Okay.
and They can be tactile, like feeling like something is on you, and they can be auditory. Then there's also delusions, where you have fixed false beliefs about something. Of course, one of the problems as somebody who goes through it is you don't realize that
You
they're
don't
false.
recognize it. Yeah.
That's kind of the part of it. But that's
Right.
one of the places where families can notice something, but also if what they concentrate on is contradicting her, that can cause her to distrust them, to become paranoid, and to really resist any help. And that's really problematic. So knowing how to respond to that is important. And sort of in a nutshell, it's a break with reality. What you are experiencing is not actually akin to what is going on.
Mhm. Right. That's right. So, and the reality of it is sometimes people kind of wax and wane in and out, right? So
Absolutely.
they could be in reality and suddenly out of reality and then back in reality, and it it can be a little bit harder to detect. But this is where, like you said, having the family monitor and understand what's going on, should there be something that seems a little bit odd or off, or, again, out of touch with reality, this is when people need to get help right away because it is a medical emergency, right?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things we stress, is that if you think there's something wrong, it's better to get help and see if there's something you really need to be concerned about than to wait for something to escalate. Because other things that really matter, besides the tragedies we hear about, is women are more likely to suffer an increasing amount of trauma the longer it takes for them to get care.
Yeah.
And that's something that's oftentimes sort of overlooked, but it's significant for those who experience it. Women even have PTSD from their experience of perinatal psychosis,
Yeah.
not to mention all sorts of anxiety issues after they recover because of what the symptoms were.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it can be very scary, right? Especially when you're coming out and back into reality and hearing all of the things that maybe one was going through with hallucinations, delusions. Obviously it could be a medical emergency because also, suicidality, right? Is it 5% of women are at risk of suicidality and 4% at risk of harming the newborn infant or child, right?
Yeah, and
And
those are the best stats we know currently on that. I mean, there's a lot more research that needs to be done in any number of areas regarding this. Um, we're really sort of only scratching the surface, but yes, I mean that's what the estimates are.
Mhm, mhm. Well, we want to talk about, this is I know for a lot of people it's kind of a scary diagnosis where people don't really understand it, or maybe they see it on the TV or media and they see these worst case scenario outcomes, and then that certainly can cause a lot of emotions for different people, right? But taking out those worst case scenarios and just looking at the whole spectrum of what can happen within a perinatal psychosis, right? We want to talk about early treatment. We want to even talk about before that prevention. So let's talk a little bit about that. What do you think the barriers are for people to get proper prevention, early treatment, and then treatment should they have this diagnosis?
So that is a much longer conversation than the time we have, but sort of some of that in a nutshell. I don't think we
Yeah.
can separate it from what we see on TV because I think that causes fear, and fear causes us to want to turn our backs on it and say, "Whew, something like that couldn't happen to someone we love." This person I know would never hurt somebody. I know myself. I would never hurt somebody. So that's the first falsehood, right? Is
Okay.
that you can turn your back on that. You're better off not knowing because it's not going to touch you anyway. Because
That's right.
half
That's
of the
right.
women who get it had no reason to expect that they were going to get it. And refusing to learn about it does not protect you from harm. Then the
Yes.
next thing is that we hear that it's rare, right? And we actually don't have good stats on it, but rare feeds our temptation to say, not going to happen to us, right?
Mm.
It's so rare, it's not likely to happen. Much more common than a number of other things we fear, like shark attacks or plane crashes and all those sort of things. Um, so it can happen to somebody who gets pregnant. That's the
Yes.
big risk factor. And then there are some things that heighten risk, but there's no risk. Then on top of that, we have this myth that it's obvious. So, well, it's not going to happen to someone I love. It wouldn't happen anyway because it's so rare. And if it was obvious, we'd notice and she would be able to get help and everything would be fine, right? When you combine all of those things, that's a huge barrier to care because people don't want to learn about it. And even a lot of professionals come at it from an aspect of, well, you're not likely to see this, so you don't really need to be that prepared. And it is, to me, that makes awareness one of the most important things. And not just awareness, but awareness where we're really deliberate about how we're talking about it, where we really understand the consequences of the terms that we use when we're raising awareness.
Mhm. Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm coming from a clinical kind of like psychotherapy training. Is we know that some of the red flags that certainly when I have any pregnant clients, I'm already providing psychoeducation for them about all sorts of different emotional complications that can arise, mood, anxiety disorders, including perinatal psychosis, right? Or postpartum psychosis. So, often what we talk about is knowing your mental health history, right? If you have
Yes.
a mental health history, if your family has any mental health history, which sometimes our parents and grandparents and so forth, people didn't really look into mental health. Maybe they just kind of pushed it aside and, oh, something's going on, but we don't know what. And, it's the big elephant in the room that nobody ever really wants to talk about it. And we just tiptoe around this. But in fact, knowing our personal mental health history and our family mental health history can be helpful in prevention, right? And when we
Absolutely.
those red flags, we can already make a plan, a preventative plan to help somebody, whether it's depression, anxiety, or in this case, like a postpartum psychosis. And what we do see is often if they have any sort of psychotic history, personal or family history, or bipolar, like a mood disorder history, right? Then that can also be a red flag for perinatal psychosis or postpartum psychosis.
Absolutely. And really, it amazes me that we don't educate everybody who has a history of bipolar or a family history of bipolar, that they are at an increased risk of
Yeah.
getting this, because you're absolutely right. And then the prevention that you're talking about, there really are a couple of different things, right? We're talking about, are there ways to prevent the illness itself? And then are there ways to prevent the harm that comes with the illness? And
Yes.
then when we talk about harm, we're talking about a couple different things. We're talking about the trauma, and we're talking about tragedies. And we're
Mm,
talking about things regarding relationships, right? There are a lot of
that's right.
divorces,
That's right.
or there are a lot of people who lose their jobs, and how to take protective measures about that. So having a plan, actually, I think everybody should have a plan
That's right. I
about
believe that.
what they would do that addresses perinatal psychosis, because if you have that lined up, boy, you got a lot lined up for whether or not you have a mood disorder or whether something goes wrong physically.
That's right.
um and is it, overdoing it? It might be, but given the spectrum of things that can go wrong with regard to mood or physical during pregnancy or postpartum, the amount of work you put into a plan is pretty insignificant.
That's right. That's right. And should any of my clients, or maybe somebody that does this type of work as well as a perinatal mental health specialist, certainly we would have a preventative, right, plan that can include psychotherapy. That might obviously include medications, right? So psychiatric treatment. And then obviously having positive supports with family or other types of positive supports in the family. People maybe bringing in the significant other, the spouse, so that again, everybody's aware of this risk factor and everybody can kind of, we're all kind of monitoring the person to make sure people are moving towards health instead of not moving towards health and potentially, being in a dangerous situation.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
want to underline something you just said, because this is something we oftentimes recommend to anybody who's at risk or anybody who thinks they have it, which is working with a perinatal mental health specialist, because it is different when you go
Yes.
to somebody who really understands. And if you think you're at risk, or just even in general, even if you're not somebody who is at risk for perinatal psychosis, even depression or anxiety, you owe it to yourself to work with a perinatal mental health specialist, to create a plan, and to go afterwards if something happens to somebody who really has studied and understands these illnesses. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's an important distinction.
Absolutely. And this, Teresa, because I know you've been very involved with Postpartum Support International. And, a lot of us have done different trainings in regards to perinatal mental health as a specialty. But it is so important because we're not just dealing with the client before us, right? We're dealing with the pregnant mom and a developing fetus. And then we're dealing with the postpartum mom with a newborn slash infant. And then never mind, we're really not just dealing with them. There's a whole family dynamic going on, right? Like you said, right? So we're really people that are specialized are trained in asking more questions because we have a lot more things to take into consideration here. It's not just the client before us sitting in a chair.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And that family can include other kids. This isn't necessarily a
Yes.
first time mom situation. Um, and single moms, they are going to be relying on their community as well. So even beyond the family, who's your support? Yeah, knowing to ask those kinds of questions is, well, it's wonderful. I applaud you.
Well, I am just one of the many providers out there that are specialized in this niche, but it is very important, like you said, to connect with somebody that has the proper training, just so, again, we're trained to ask all the questions, right? And be able to provide, maybe, again, help for all these different factors that we discussed.
Right.
But again, we want to stress the fact that prevention is key. If you can prevent something from happening, this is absolutely key, and it's possible, right?
Yes, it's
Even
very
with
highly
postpartum,
treatable. Highly
yes,
treatable.
it's highly treatable, but it's actually even preventable,
Right.
right? But when we actually start looking already and preparing for things while mom is pregnant, and it's highly treatable. But should somebody feel off guard and suddenly have these symptoms, the best protocol is, of course, to call emergency numbers, right? Or go to the nearest emergency room.
If you don't already have a plan with a
Yes.
provider, which
Yes.
would be the ideal thing, right? Is to
Of
work with
course.
somebody ahead of time to have a plan where that is not your best option. If you haven't done that, it is your best option.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that doesn't mean it's a great option. Not to knock anybody in that area, who works in the ER, but oftentimes they don't have the training to really understand a lot of the sort of atypical presentations of a perinatal psychosis. So yeah, the importance of having a plan. But if you don't have a plan, yes, the rule of thumb is usually emergency services and ER visit.
Yeah. So calling 911 in your
Mm-hmm.
state or province, or like Connecticut, where we are, is 211. So knowing what the emergency number is for mental health, and or going to the emergency room. But like you mentioned, if you have a psychiatrist already or psychotherapist, having them involved in it, and then potentially collaborating with, if obviously an inpatient hospitalization is required, then you're going to be, we just want to make sure people are safe first and foremost, right? As mental health providers, as perinatal mental health specialists or psychiatrists or reproductive psychiatrists, we need to make sure people are safe,
Right.
right? And then we can do all the work after, right? We can work on the traumas, we can work on coping skills, we can work on, helping people start feeling more like themselves, because that's what women want to feel. They want to feel more like themselves again, obviously ASAP, right? As soon as
Right.
possible.
Absolutely.
Um,
And that soon as possible, there's an underline for that with perinatal psychosis. When I was taking a lot of calls regarding families who were in crisis with this, and one of the main things I heard was they didn't want her to go inpatient, and that she was somebody who would never hurt somebody. She loved her child, whatever. And really, unfortunately, with perinatal psychosis, one of the unexpected things is women, out of love for their child, can believe what's necessary and best is to kill the child. It's called an altruistic killing. It is one of the most tragic things you can imagine. But saying she loves the child and wouldn't hurt anybody is not protective.
that's
So
right.
underlining the being safe, it's not just her safety, it's the safety for all those around her. And that
Absolutely.
has to be a priority above anything. Stigma, inconvenience, not wanting to have that associated with her, whatever you might be concerned about. Safety is the number one.
That's right. And that's why sometimes that hospitalization is required to, because people may not be able to monitor somebody
Right.
24/7, right? And this is why, it is considered a medical emergency. So
Yep,
we need to act
exactly.
upon that, and we need to get people that right help so that they are safe, and the infant, right? And anybody else around, any other children, um, and the mom, right? Because of this, it is a very, very high risk uh, medical emergency, like we talked about. So again, we've talked about prevention, we've talked about treatment is available, and we've talked about, if you have no providers, what to do in a crisis, right? That is really important. And so I know we have a little bit more time, but Teresa, tell us a little bit about the stages of recovery for women that suffer from perinatal psychosis.
Okay, so The stages of recovery, well, you've got the acute phase, and that's really the intensive treatment to get you past the symptoms of psychosis.
Yes.
And a lot of times a woman will be in hospital for that. And
Mm.
then when she's released, sometimes there will be some lingering psychosis type or periods of brief psychosis type of symptoms. But more often you're dealing with anxiety, you're dealing with depression, you're dealing with other complications, which may or may not rise to the level of mood disorder, because if you're seeing somebody and you're getting proper care, those get managed. So your anxiety might not be clinical anxiety. It might just be anxiety because you've been through something that's anxiety provoking, right? So with proper care, those should be manageable. Doesn't mean that you're well when you leave the hospital. When you get past that sort of daily coping, the next thing really is healing from having had the illness.
Mm.
So a lot of times women will have um, guilt, they'll struggle with the stigma, self-blame. Um, there's oftentimes a constant fear of, could it happen to me again? There are many long range things, and there, if you don't get treatment, I've talked to women who are still struggling emotionally,
Mm.
literally 40 years later,
Wow.
because they've never processed it fully.
Yeah. Yes.
And in processing that, one of the things we're really trying to advocate is having some more specialized training about the traumas
That's
that
right.
go with this illness, and having people have trauma informed care specific to perinatal psychosis to really help women fully recover. Because unfortunately, too often what we've seen is women go to process these things after they've been through it. And in one terrible situation that happened last year, the therapist didn't understand that these women's thoughts of harming her child when she had been ill, right, were no longer a concern, and she called DFS, right, which is the
Oh, wow.
100% wrong thing to do. And a lot of times women are already a little bit um,
Leery.
sensitive about mental health providers
Yeah.
because of the experiences they've had. So we really need to have much more available care that is specialized for these women, because it is a struggle for a while to get to the point where you are feeling really well mentally.
Yes, yes, yes. So really dealing with the acute symptoms first and foremost in treatment and the recovery, and then dealing with any trauma and kind of like healing from this, because it is such a huge thing that, takes people more often than not, they're caught off guard, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it can definitely, like you said, cause relational issues, marital issues, and so forth. So really understanding that, there's phases to recovery is so important. So any last tips, Teresa, that you would like to give anyone that might be watching today that might be struggling or may have already struggled with perinatal psychosis, or maybe they have a friend or family that they are concerned about right now? Any last words that you would like to give to them today?
Yeah. So no matter where you are, if you're struggling to get the help you need at any stage, or you're struggling to find help for a loved one, keep trying. Don't fear saying, this provider really doesn't get it, I need to go to somebody else. If you're struggling to find a provider, contact Postpartum Support International. They've got a lot of providers, a provider directory, and there are other organizations who have some of that type of thing available as well. So reach out to the organizations that deal with this, and keep trying
Yes.
till you find somebody who fits, because you deserve it.
Yes, yes. So again, Postpartum Support International, which is postpartum.net. If you're looking on the internet, you can find resources there and supports, crisis number and so forth in regard, and also, like you mentioned, referrals for people in your state or province or whatever country you might live in. Postpartum Support International is a great resource.
Yep.
Really quick question, Teresa. I know that you have been involved in 2024 PPP Awareness Day. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I know that's coming up.
Absolutely. So, as I said earlier, I think raising awareness, learning about this illness, being prepared is one of the best protections against harm. So we are trying to, we have an awareness day trying to raise awareness. We've got stories on our page. We've got a resource for survivors who want to share their stories. We've got a blog post, a blog with different posts, partly about having more sensitivity regarding language. And we are continually working to add those types of ongoing resources so people can learn more about it and be more prepared. On the awareness day itself, which is May 3rd, this year, we will be having a an online Zoom event, but also we'll be having a lunch and learn for professionals on the 14th of May. Um, and so we ask for people to support our efforts. This is a survivor-led effort and survivor-informed effort. And we really believe that the number one key is raising awareness. So I really appreciate, Carla, you doing this and having me on here, because we don't have a way to count the number of lives we save, but we do know that people tell us, you saved my life.
Wow. Yeah. Whew. Yep. I get choked up just hearing a little bit about that, and even reading your book. I know there's testimonies in here, and yeah, this is what this is all about, right, Teresa? Is really helping others, empowering, educating, bringing that awareness, empowering them so that they can get the help, their families can get the help, and people can be more informed, so people can move towards feeling healthier, right, for themselves and in their family. And so I just love what you're doing. I love this group support, through PPP Awareness Day, where survivors are here to tell their stories so more people can get help and more lives can be saved. Um, Really, really tremendous work you guys are doing.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
yes. And if anybody would like to reach out to Teresa Twomey, again, amazing consultant, author, speaker, and authority for perinatal psychosis, what is the best way to reach out to you today?
So the best way is just my email, which is T for Teresa, M for my middle initial, like Mary, and then my last name, Twomey, and with the number 2 afterwards at gmail.com. And
Excellent.
then put something in the subject line that indicates what you're looking for, because if I think something is just junk, I will usually not open it. And I absolutely never open something if someone doesn't have or I never click on a link if someone says, please do this or contact me here. You have to explain why you're contacting me.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I get that. There's a lot of junk mail these days, so you want to
Right,
make sure you can filter that out.
right,
All
right.
right. Well, Teresa, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on the show today. Amazing work. I'm going to continue to cheer you on, and I'd love to, you know, together as we link arms, I know we can all really help to make greater impact in our communities and in our world. So thank you so much for joining today. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and clarity about the amazing work you're doing as a consultant, writer, speaker, and authority in perinatal psychosis. Again, if anybody would like to be in touch with Teresa Twomey, please contact her via TMTWOMEY, the number 2 at gmail.com. Also, for information about PPP Awareness Day, please see www.pppawarenessday.org. And if you have found this time to be educational, empowering, and insightful to your health and well-being, please click on the button below to subscribe to my channel. Also, please feel free to share this with friends and family and anyone you think would benefit from today's episode on perinatal psychosis. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to sharing what you need to know next time. Take care and be well.